Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for turning out tonight for Wrecking Ball, a program of Village Preservation with Adrian Untermyer. Before we get started, a couple quick things. First of all, our eternal thanks and gratitude to Jefferson Market Library for hosting us tonight, Frank Valerius and the entire staff. And what a perfect location for a program about the history of historic preservation, particularly in New York City. Preservation battles, really one of the iconic preservation victories, but very nearly great tragic preservation losses for our city. Just a couple of words about Village Preservation, and hopefully you either, first of all, of course, many of you know Village Preservation very well, but feel free to pick up a copy of our newsletter in the back or our membership brochure. We do about 75 to 80 programs like this a year. They're generally all free and open to the public, but it's really the generosity of our members that allow us to do that and to do all of the other work that we do, which is fighting to document, celebrate, and protect the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village in NoHo, everything from our small businesses and cultural institutions to our beautiful historic architecture, our incredibly rich and diverse history of civil rights, social justice, artistic movements, immigration, all of which we seek to highlight and celebrate. And you, our members, really power that. We are a nonprofit, membership-based organization, so your generosity allows us to do that. We have a couple more great programs coming up in August. We have a walking tour tomorrow, although I believe it's already full. Native American history in our neighborhoods. And next week we have a book talk at the Hudson Park Library, Swimming to Jerusalem by author Seth Bornstein, based in part on his life in the West Village. It's a really, really interesting read. We've got a few spaces left for that, so please join us for that. So I want to introduce our wonderful speaker tonight, but I also want to just kind of tell you a little bit about the format for tonight's program. I'm going to be turning it over to Adrian shortly. He's going to make a wonderful presentation about Wrecking Ball, his new podcast, and all of the subject matter that it covers in relation to preservation battles in New York, particularly around legal history. I'm going to ask Adrian a couple of questions. We're going to have a little bit of dialogue, and then we're going to open it up to you for Q&A. So you'll definitely get a chance to ask questions. Just hold it for that portion of the evening. So let me tell you a little bit about Adrian, for those of you who don't know him, although of course a lot of people here do. Adrian's the creator and host of Wrecking Ball, a new podcast series featuring tales of preservation, the law, and places New Yorkers love from the Historical Society of the New York Courts. Not an organization you hear about that often, but a very active one. And we'll learn a little bit more about them. I know Adrian because he used to be the deputy director of the Historic Districts Council, which is one of our city's great historic preservation organizations, where he was there from 2015 to 2017, and we in the Historic Districts Council are longtime neighbors in the old rectory of St. Mark's Church on East 11th Street. Adrian's a frequent panelist and commentator on preservation, legal, and transportation issues impacting New York and the nation in outlets ranging from the New York Times to the Transportation Law Journal. He's a practicing attorney admitted in New York and New Jersey, and currently works in-house at New Jersey Transit, where he serves as the rail operations management team and tackles projects ranging from multi-billion-dollar infrastructure investments for the preservation of historic railroad equipment. That is quite a portfolio you have there, Adrian. He's also the vice chair and treasurer of the Woodlawn Cemetery Conservancy in the Bronx and an active director of the New York Preservation Archive Project. To listen to Wrecking Ball, visit history.nycourts.gov/podcast, and to learn more about Adrian or get in touch, just visit adrianuntermyer.com, and also just pick up one of those cards in the back and or sign up on his email list. So with that, I will turn it over to Adrian.
everybody. I said, good evening, everybody. Good evening this evening. I, as you will discover throughout the course of this evening, can be a bit of a purist. So I am very happy to be here with Village Preservation. However, I am overjoyed to have the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation in the house tonight. So it is so lovely to be visiting with you all as we discuss Wrecking Ball, which is a new podcast. Hold on, 1 second. There we are. Which is a new podcast about preservation, the law, and the incredible city and state of New York. So as Andrew mentioned, we're going to start with a brief presentation by myself. We're going to just do that in 3 parts. It's going to be, first of all, setting the stage. What brings us all here tonight, talking about Wrecking Ball new podcast. Then we definitely want to get into some of the tales that we covered on the Wrecking Ball podcast. And we're going to round things out by talking a little bit about what is next. But I think the perfect place to set the stage is the place that we're all sitting in right now here tonight. The historic Jefferson Market Courthouse, which of course was a courthouse. This is one of the old places, as George McAnee used to call them, the places where people would convene historically for all sorts of reasons, starting with legal issues, criminal issues. There used to be a house of detention on this site. And then moving on to adaptive reuse, right? It's the story of the podcast embodied in the hallowed walls of this place, the story of preservation, the law, and the places that we love. So let's start with the preservation component, right? We're here in this gorgeous adaptively reused space, in no small part thanks to the advocacy and activism of so many people in this room and those who came before us, fighting for a courthouse to remain a part of this urban fabric, ensuring that it wasn't consigned to the dustbin of history, but it came alive as a second life, as a historic library. That was a fight, and that covers that first theme of our podcast. But there's also that legal component, and I just love this image. This is justice in New York. One thing that I didn't tell Andrew about, but I'll tell you, we recently released at the Historical Society of New York Courts the New York County legal history, going all the way back to Lenape and carrying all the way through to the summer of 2020 with George Floyd. It's a lot of material. We squeezed it into less than 100 pages, or appendices and footnotes and all that. But rough justice was the theme in New York for many, many years. So if you were sitting in this building a couple hundred years ago, it would not be a bunch of nice folks in a library smiling. It would have been, all rise. And that was what this place was all about. So we have the preservation, we have the law, we of course have the people. Thank you, yes, please. Margot Gale and so many others, the people who love these places. New York, all 3 of those things under one roof here this evening. Now, quick pop quiz, and there may be a few of these here tonight. Raise your hand if you know the great Susan Hopper. Anybody know Susan Hopper from the Historic Districts Council? I think 1 or 2 people. There we go, Howard knows her. She has a great saying about preservation. And it's not preservation as old buildings. It's not preservation as the sort of thing where we get together and say, fight, fight, fight. Her line is preservation is people. Because that's what it's all about. It's about our community pulling together and fighting to ensure that future communities can benefit from that rich urban fabric, can enjoy the lessons of time, enjoy the lessons of the past. And that's what Wrecking Ball is all about, and that's what tonight is all about. So, I'll clue you in on something else. We end every episode on Wrecking Ball. We're not at the end of my talk, so don't go out just yet, but we end with a segment that we call Your Daily Ada Louise. Now, I'm going to ask you guys for another pop quiz. Who's heard Ada Louise? Yeah, much, much better. Ada Louise Huxtable, the legendary New York Times architectural critic, columnist, I would argue civic leader. And we honor Ada Louise on Wrecking Ball at the end of every single program by sharing a quote of hers, discussing how it ties into those themes that we were mentioning earlier. And so I would like to introduce tonight's proceedings proceedings, fittingly, that were at a courthouse, with a line from this piece of hers entitled Old Jeff's Conversion. And as far as I can tell, this was the piece that ran when they were celebrating the opening of this new, beautiful, adaptively reused library. And the quote reads as follows. Essentially, enough stubborn, sentimental, highly articulate, politically shrewd people cared for its homely virtues. Now, I don't think this is a homely building, but that's exactly what happened. And those are exactly the sorts of people that you have been surrounded with your entire lives, and that I have been surrounded with my entire life. And that is really why Wrecking Ball came to be. I'll tell you a little bit about that sort of melange that I grew up in. This guy is my great-great-grandfather, Samuel Untermyer. He's famous, of course, for those beautiful gardens in Yonkers, New York. Many of us have been up there. Many of us have been up there to enjoy, to celebrate, or just to sort of sit back and soak it all in. But he's famous for other reasons as well. These two gentlemen, J.P. Morgan, J. Pierpont Morgan, and of course, the gentleman at the right, Adolf Hitler. Not remembered fondly, largely, I think it's fair to say. Samuel, of course, is blamed for J.P. Morgan's death because of a cross-examination that Samuel delivered before the famous Peugeot Commission in the United States Congress. And of course, Samuel's also credited for bringing the United States into World War II to fight Adolf Hitler. He said something is rotten in Germany again and again. Of course, Pearl Harbor happens, but Samuel was known for frantically racing to Roosevelt and saying, my goodness, we need to do something about the Jews and about Europe. So that was part of his legacy, and he was a frequent civic leader, some would say gadfly, but those terms tend to shift over time, right? I think many people would say that Margot Gale was somewhat of a gadfly, but we do not remember her that way today. And that lineage really carried throughout my family history. Many players within my family have contributed to preservation, the law, and the city. This is Ethel Untermyer, my grandmother, speaking in a snowstorm in Chicago. She wrote, typed, and mimeographed a ballot measure to fight for a forest preserve district in rapidly suburbanizing Chicago's suburbs. And the Lake County Forest Reserve remains one of the most treasured forest preserve districts in the country today. And it led me to my work, as we mentioned earlier, at the Historic Districts Council today as an attorney and elsewhere, where we really started to consider these themes that we just can't seem to get away from. Preservation, the law, and the city we love. So that's how we got here, setting the stage. But let's talk a little bit about Wrecking Ball and the stories that we engage with there. But first of all, it may have been a while for some of us. It's a podcast. What is a podcast, right? This is a term that we hear thrown around quite a bit today. We hear people famous, infamous, not so famous, having podcasts of their own. I mean, it's essentially this. It's a program in audio or visual form. In our case, it's both. It is presented in a digital format. So, sorry, but no reel-to-reel here. You gotta go online to download it. And it's available on the internet, in our case for free, in many cases for free. And so that's what Wrecking Ball is. This is a screenshot from our first episode, and I think this does a little bit of work for us explaining what Wrecking Ball is all about, right? Up at the top, you have our incredible presenter, the Historical Society of the New York Courts. They should be your best friend. These are natural preservation allies, largely judges and practicing attorneys, some lay people who are also involved with the courts, and they put on a tremendous docket, I will use that word, of events all throughout the state of New York, but including here in New York City. They have one coming up on September 7th about the famed Lemon slave case down at 60 Center Street, which of course is our monumental New York County Courthouse. So that is our partner on putting on Wrecking Ball. And just below it, you will see our logo, which of course features our Wrecking Ball, and a screenshot from our first conversation. You'll notice a few people who were involved with episode 1, one of whom I hope is very familiar to many of you, Mr. Anthony C. Wood, Chair Emeritus of the Historic Districts Council, founder of the New York Preservation Archive Project, and still an influence for many of us in preservation today. And we paired him, who I think is fair to call an expert, with someone who's an expert in many other fields, not necessarily historic preservation, but American history, political history. She's a frequent commentator in the New York Times, CBS News, WNYC. She hosts for Brian Lair. Dr. Christina Greer, she teaches at Fordham University, and she brings that outsider perspective, because I think a lot of us in this room tonight love preservation and know preservation, but we know that feeling when we're talking about a building or a neighborhood that we're fighting for at a cocktail party, and the eyes glaze over, and people don't really understand that most ephemeral of essences, which of course is the preservation ethic. It is coursing through everyone's bloodstream in this room, and I think it courses through a lot more bloodstreams throughout the city, the state, and the nation, because we have a lot of natural allies. So that was episode 1, and I wanted to just share a couple of those preservation stories from that episode with you all, and wanted to just feature them. And we really started off chronologically, talking about Fort Clinton, Castle Clinton, that famed fortification down in what we now call Battery Park. But when we think back to old New York, right? Not even the old New York of the Jefferson Market Courthouse, but generations prior. This is a port city. And I think it remains a port city. It's where the cross currents of ideas, ideologies, people, personalities, nationalities, it all comes together in this town. But of course, when you have a literal port kind of protected, you have a series of historic fortifications. And this was one of them. You can tell it's a fort, or at least it was a fort in this picture. But as time passed and the fortification sort of became obsolete, we'll say, for military purposes, it, in fact, was adaptively reused, right? So there's that first preservation of preservation, the law, and the city, preserved and adaptively reused as a beloved aquarium. It was the New York Aquarium in those days. I believe it was a McKinney and White enclosure, addition, whatever you want to call it, sort of ensconcing this historic fortification in a new, fun aquarium setting that really draw people from all over the city there. But, and this is where the second theme of the law comes in, a certain somebody set his crosshairs on Fort Clinton. Yes. We all know who it was, right? It was the infamous Robert Moses. And he wanted to build a bridge, right? When we had Tony on the episode, he was talking a little bit about bridge versus tunnel. And he said, well, you know, Robert Moses had a lot of great things about bridges to say, and tunnels, well, he didn't have good things to say about tunnels. And that's the way that Tony put it, and it was exactly right. Much like the line about Nelson Rockefeller, the edifice complex, we know that Robert Moses as well was obsessed with these grand arterial highways, sort of his own edifices really running through the city. Unfortunately, much of his vision was, of course, realized, but not this one. And that's where the law comes in. Because of familiarity, I think I would credit to. It was familiarity with these old places. There's that term again, the old places, the familiar sites. And the Battery was one of them. It was a place that everybody understood in that time. Everybody had a relationship with, everybody knew where it was, and everybody understood what it meant to rip down an old fortification like Castle Clinton to build something newfangled that they didn't necessarily think they needed. So a group of civic leaders really banded together and said, we need to put a stop to this. And these were legal luminaries in many cases. C.C. Berman, George Francis McEnany, who of course was the former borough president of Manhattan, former head of the Board of Aldermen, worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad at one time, contributing to Penn Station, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. These guys said, no, hands off our castle. But in some senses, it was too late. And I think this is an interesting reminder of the times we just lived through, right? Because George McEnany, he was the light and air guy. He was about preservation before we really even had a vocabulary for preservation. But he was behind that 1916 zoning resolution, right? Under the tutelage of people like Edward Morse Shepherd, others who were really in that civic bloodstream. And here you just have this classic Powers cartoon of McEnany taking a saw to a tall building. We have saws in the back for after the lecture if anybody wants to grab one. And a little figure here with a flag that says joy, and beneath it, light, air, that's the dope. So, these guys band together. They say no more, they rattle cages, they do this, they do that. Moses thinks he wins. right? But they get to Roosevelt during wartime and say, look, this bridge, if it were to go down, it would impede navigation. It would be impossible to get to the Brooklyn Navy Yards, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, it was a more complicated story than that, and we'll never know the full story. But we do have to remember that there are other bridges spanning New York Harbor. So perhaps that might have been a little bit of pretext because they could have easily hit the Brooklyn Bridge and gone into the water. But in preservation, you sometimes have to take every toehold you can get. So they thought they won. But Mr. Moses wanted to take his revenge, and he quite literally ordered the demolition of the castle through what was a legal process, right? Talking pre-landmarks law, pre any designation of Castle Clinton. And they ripped down that Acadean white structure and they literally dump all of the fish in the aquarium into the sea.
Oh.
Into the sea. But the preservationists had the last laugh. Because we had that original preservation, conversion, the adaptive reuse. Then we had the legal issue of Moses ripping apart this beloved structure, desecrating it. But then you had the people who loved New York. George Mackinnon and his allies, they get to Washington. They outfox Moses. The demolition, while they did get that old structure, the bones of the castle were still intact. They were so big that the wartime bans on heavy machinery and all that, right, we need it for the war effort, that actually paused the demolition. Someone saved the castle, and they swoop in and they have it designated as a national memorial. And I am proud to say that Castle Clinton still stands today. You should all go down there. So that's one of our tales, but I alluded to another one from episode 1. Lorraine, she dubbed it the late great Pennsylvania Station. And I think it's an excellent, excellent moniker. Because when we think of this other old place, here's another story about preservation and the law and the places we love. Remember that guy, George Mackinnon? Remember I said he worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad? He was doing lobbying for them, oddly enough, to build the station because there used to be a neighborhood there. Pennsylvania Railroad wanted to conquer Gotham, as famous Jill Jonas once wrote, and they decided to build tubes, aqueous tubes, very new technology, under the Hudson River, into the core of Manhattan, raise massive tracts of land for this new tunnel and terminal complex, and then burrow 4 more tunnels east into Queens, build up mammoth Sunnyside yards, tie the whole thing into the Long Island Railroad, run a new route up to Boston, run car floats across the harbor. I mean, it's the sort of infrastructure project that today we see very few of in the city, if at all. But he managed to get it through, and he managed to get it through in a way that seemed to please everybody. But, of course, there were fatal flaws with the design. Anybody here ever enjoyed using Penn Station? Even the current, well, we got 1. I might be the only one, we got 2. Well, we'll get to that. But the former Penn Station, the 1910 concoction, while it was beautiful, functionally it was a little tricky. There were a lot of design issues, and there was, of course, the issue of paying for it, because the Pennsylvania Railroad, when it built it, was a big, mighty corporation, standard railroad of the world, wealthier than pretty much anybody else. They didn't see any need to put in offices, hotels, those sorts of things. They did have things like the Hotel Pennsylvania in the neighborhood. They did have a grand shopping arcade within the station, but they left a lot of what developers might call dead space in the facility. And so as the Pennsylvania Railroad began hemorrhaging cash and undertakes an ill-fated merger ultimately with New York Central to form the Penn Central, ends up being the largest corporate bankruptcy in United States history until Enron. They were looking at the couch cushions, and in a pre-landmarks law environment, there's our second theme of the law. They figured that this thing was worth more dead than alive. They built Madison Square Garden on top of the fabled train station, ripped it to the ground. The bones stayed in place and remain in place, of course, as a great train hall. But there it is again, that initial loss. But I would say that the fight at that time, and we just celebrated last summer a major anniversary of that famous 1962 picket. You know, of course, here you see Jane Jacobs, you see Philip Johnson, there's so many other notables who were there at the time, battling for preservation, just like all of you in the crowd have your entire careers, just as Andrew does each and every day. They demanded something better. And many see Penn Station, I am not necessarily one of them, but many do say that it was the domino that had to fall to really shock the conscience. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. There were many other structures throughout the city that gave people the sense of things slipping away at the time based on the historical record. But it was a contributing factor, and it is the de facto symbol across this nation of that loss, of how painful it is when a city loses its landmarks, loses its identity. So while the original Penn Station may have been demolished in that phased demolition in the mid-60s, it remains a subject of intense debate today. And I think it's really reinvigorated a lot of the civic architecture in the city because of it being that preservation hallowed ground. So there's that third theme of the podcast again. Preservation, we have it, the law, and the people who love those places that make New York, New York. Which brings me to our final example. The place that we're in right now, beautiful Greenwich Village, the place that you all fight so tirelessly to protect each and every day. I think of this neighborhood as the crucible. I really do. This is the place where these legal figures, right? Robert Moses, of course, he is not just a guy on the street. He is a person who held all these various perches throughout city and state government. Executive branch. He is a person who wrote many portions of the Public Authorities Law, which, when you think about it, is why we see these mega authorities getting away with so much in New York City and state, because someone wrote a law that said they could. And who was it? You know, with the protection of Al Smith and other political figures, with the protection of elected officials who'd rather not go around him, with the contractor community. I think we forget about them as preservationists often, who have lobbying dollars and people with careers who depend on building things that are new. He put a leash around their neck and ensured they had a steady stream of projects coming their way, but they had to cooperate with them. So that's legislative branch, and of course judicial branch, because of all the different litigations and actions and claims that happened over the years, and many of them unsuccessful, that contributed to that. And then of course you have Jane on the right? I mean, beloved Jane, someone we remember so fondly today. Her books are literally taught in college courses now. I think a lot of people never would have expected something like that. And she epitomizes that preservation ethic that we mentioned a little bit earlier in this conversation. And the best of civic engagement in many ways in civic activism, because this is how the system is supposed to work. Really, I mean, we talk about people being disenfranchised. When people are disenfranchised, they cannot participate in the process, right? But if everybody's on that equal playing field, you're supposed to be able to raise a ruckus and get government to do something. It kills me these days when I see people dragged out of public meetings for disrupting them. Because why do those public meetings exist? Why did people like Jane smash the transcription devices in public meetings famously? To get people's attention, to show that they gave a damn and convince others to do the same. Not always the right tactic, right? You have to treat preservation like a Swiss Army knife, and you need to use the right tool for the right circumstance. And sometimes that means partnering and working with developers, who the great Christabel Goff prefers to call investors, because it better characterizes their motivations and allows for us to be a bit more clear-eyed when dealing with them. To work with them when we need to destroy them when they deserve it, and to fight for a city that reflects our ideals and our ideologies. And of course, those values end up codified in the law. Right, here we have a picture of that last car through Washington Square. What a victory. When was the last time you saw revenue traffic passing through Washington Square? We don't stop to think about things like that tonight. And we have Jonathan Kuhn in the audience here from the Parks Department of the City of New York. I think it's safe to say that Jonathan has no plans to reinsert cars and buses over Washington Square. And that is a testament to the leadership of the people in this room who continue to fight for a village that matters, fight for an island of Manhattan that matters, the 5 boroughs, the counties, the state, the nation, and the world. These are the jurisdictions we need to think about as we're engaging in these preservation battles. And that's one of the reasons why we convene here tonight. And another point that Tony made in that first episode, and I think it's an important point for us all to remember, is that this is the stage set for the great conversations of our time. That is why we protect these neighborhoods. Yes, we love beautiful buildings. I was in awe walking around this place today. But what hurts me more is something that I saw outside of my walk-in, right? We all remember during the Bloomberg years when there were all these weird things popping up. We got a reminder of that with the giant cell towers that appeared on the street recently, right? But one of those things that popped up during Mayor Mike's tenure were those map boards all along the sidewalks. You see them still to this day. There's one right outside. There's just a walking map of the neighborhood and it explains how you can get around. And as I was looking at that map outside and I walked in here today, there weren't a lot of pictures of buildings, but there was a beautiful illustration of the Jefferson Market Courthouse on the map. That's your landmark. That's what tells you you're in Greenwich Village. And that's what inspires people like this, and people like you, and people who care about every issue to look up and be able to have those real interactions. We don't just sit in vehicles on 10-lane highways here in New York, right? That's for other parts of the country. We hope that they emulate our example. And that is one of the reasons I'm so joyful about the recent GVSHP, Greenwich Village Society of Historic Preservation, rebranding to Village Preservation, because of course we remain committed to preserving, protecting, and improving Greenwich Village. But we don't just do it for the sake of Greenwich Village. We do it for the sake of all villages, so they can learn from our example and foster young people and old people and everybody in between who care about their community, who are willing to fight for it, and who demand something better for this new and still young century. That's what all those stories have to tell us. It reminds us that preservation is not just a statute, right? We have Mayor Wagner down here in the bottom right-hand corner signing the Sacred Landmarks Law. It is an important law, but preservation is not just a commission. Preservation is an ethic and an ethos. It's why you're all here tonight engaging in community. It's why you engage with Andrew's group and all the other groups that you're engaged with throughout the city and the nation. So what's next for us, right? We've got this new podcast series. We've got you all here tonight. What else is on the proverbial docket for us? Well, our latest episode, which just was released last week, this is an interesting one. I shared with you earlier that I like to pair a layperson, like Dr. Christine Greer, who's very knowledgeable in many relevant issues, but not necessarily historic preservation per se, with a true subject matter expert like Tony. But in this episode, I had a one-on-one conversation with an author named Gary Stein about this gentleman on the left. Great picture. Martin T. Manton. He was the chief judge of the Second Circuit of the United States, which of course is headquartered to this day in that building there on Foley Square, 40 Foley Square. You see it and so many others at the beginning of all those sacred crime procedurals. Defines the aesthetic of justice in New York and the nation, as some sop once wrote. But Manton was one of the first occupants of that building, right? He was the chief judge, and he was engaged in a wide-ranging pattern of justice for sale. If you appeared in his courtroom, he kept a safe in his chambers. He would literally bring up cash from his litigants, put it in the safe, and then all rise, as we said earlier. And the outcome, because they sit in panels, would not necessarily be preordained, but he would arrange procedurally for certain things to happen so that the people who paid it were guaranteed to win the case. How is that relevant to preservation, the law, and the city and state of New York? I'll tell you why. Because of this debate about the purpose of great civic buildings, right? We say to ourselves, do civic buildings inspire civic virtue? Not just the government buildings, but I count all landmarks as civic buildings. Do those neighborhoods cause people to behave and act better? And Gary said something so interesting on the podcast. He said that it's not a matter of brick and mortar, but it's more a matter of flesh and blood. And I don't necessarily agree with that wholeheartedly, but it goes back to why preservation is people. We are not saving old buildings for the sake of saving old buildings. we are saving old buildings for the future. So that's the first apartment courthouse. It's a beautiful example of an old civic building. It's part of the urban fabric, and it's of course a landmark. You'll see there are tall buildings behind it, but it remains. And so while we do hope that buildings like that continue to inspire civic virtue, we also want them to continue to inspire you and inspire us as we continue our journey across the great city and state of New York. I hope you stay tuned for future episodes of the podcast as we travel all around the state, not just here in New York County. I think if Maya knows what's good for her, she hasn't accidentally unplugged that camera, and this is going to become an episode as well. So you can actually go on and listen to our conversation here tonight if you like, and the ones that's all edited up. So we've got a lot of interesting stuff in store for you as we talk about racquetball, not just the price we pay when we destroy the places that matter, but how people are impacted, and how an understanding of preservation, the law, and the city that we love can help shape our future and help create a city where our future includes and cherishes our past. Now, last pop quiz of the night. Maybe. How do we end our podcast? Anyone know? Our daily Hate Louise. That's exactly that. So as we transition from our presentation to our conversation, and hopefully our conversation with you as well, I would like to return to that article that we shared at the front about the Great Hate Louise Festival, about Jefferson Market Courthouse, about Old Jeff's conversion. And here's the quote. In New York, the odds against history are appalling. A jungle of building codes and agency requirements, and this one is interesting, creative inertia. Political fears and pure red tape make the preservation of a building such as Old Jeff a factual and physical impossibility. Imagine writing this as this building opened. How then does a plain old relic, I disagree, become a stunning new branch library? How does a structure of awkward Victorian grotesquerie, tone it down a little bit, survive the ruthless rule of the city's real estate economics? My hypothesis is that people started a conversation. People started a conversation. And that brings us to why we're here tonight in the great Greenwich Village, in the heart of New York, talking about preservation and the law and the places that we love. So thank you so much for your time and attention tonight, and I look forward to speaking with Andrew. Thank you all.
Adrian, that was great. And what a great way to start a conversation. I was taking some really nice notes here. There's so many directions we can go in and explore with what you brought up here. But actually where you ended brought up one point that I want to kind of tease out with you a little bit and get your thoughts on. So Ada Louise Huxtable, who I also have a tremendous amount of respect for, obviously didn't think that Jefferson Market was the most beautiful building. She obviously had a somewhat not so high opinion of it, which is very reflective of that time. This type of architecture was really disdained in the mid-20th century. As somebody who was, I'm 54, I was born in 1969, it's unfathomable to me, but Victorian architecture, the gingerbread houses, those very elaborate and detailed buildings were hated in the period before, sort of just before I was born. When I learned that, it dumbfounded me. I was like, how can an entire generation of people be so stupid to have hated this entire class of buildings? Interestingly, as I said, I'm now 54, I've seen in the course of my own life buildings and styles of architecture that I disdained when I was younger for which I've now grown somewhat affectionate. Mid-century modern architecture, for instance, which I saw no value in whatsoever, for the most part. You know, I respected the Seagram's building, Lever House, etc., but this sort of, you know, kind of standard, mass-produced 1950s, 1960s architecture, I just thought was a waste of, you know, concrete and whatever other materials it was made of. And now I find so much of it beautiful. And so our sensibilities change over time. And I'm wondering your thoughts about the role that that plays in the historic preservation movement, because a lot of what we lose because it's during a time period where it's unfashionable, and if you wait long enough, it may become fashionable again. But of course, you can't save everything and just say, well, it's eventually going to be loved. So, you know, what are your thoughts about how we deal with the fact that these are, they're shifting grounds here, and it changes over time, and how do we deal with that?
What a fantastic question. We ran into this at the Historic Districts Council during the Trump years. I don't think anyone recalls those years relatively fondly, but we thought a little bit about Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue, right? It's the iconic building that unfortunately screams Trump. It is a little garish and this and that. But you can go to any building, any city in the United States, rather, and you can see another Trump Tower, right? I was just in Denver. I saw several Trump Towers there. And so Ada Louise used the term grotesque to describe this structure. I would certainly describe Trump Tower as a bit garish and grotesque. That might be an understatement. But remember, it's not just architectural in landmarks law, right? It's also architectural, historical, cultural. And so does a building like Trump Tower, where it's repulsive to look at, the person who put it up, in my view, is repulsive. Yeah, not a controversial statement in this crowd. But it still tells the story of architecture and people in a very particular time in the United States. And so I think, and this is a point that Tony made on our first episode, Tony Wood, it was the blessing and the curse of the landmarks law that they didn't define what a landmark was, right? A landmark is whatever the commission thinks it is, as long as it checks one or more of those three boxes: architectural, historical, cultural. And so I think that is almost a gift to us, right? It's a gift to us, and it's telling us that we are free to engage in this conversation until the end of time, and may the best person win. But not making that value judgment was a fantastic and prescient thing to do. What was the downside of that? Discretion, right? We see that in policing in the United States, right? Where we see abuses of discretion, sometimes with police officers, sometimes with players in the courts, sometimes in the legislatures, the executive. In this case, we have a Landmarks Commission of the City of New York, which sits in a beautiful landmark downtown, right? And these people who are plucked from society because they themselves check a certain number of boxes, and of course a political box, they're the ones making these value judgments. So that's where it falls to the third thing of the podcast, right? The places New Yorkers love. We New Yorkers need to stand up and tell them about those places. I think Village Preservation does a fantastic job of that. I think you are one of the groups where the mayor always knows your name. The council people always know your name, because before, during, and after these elections, you were getting involved. And I think the key to this is that point we mentioned near the end of the presentation, where it's keeping that conversation going, but also being that example for other groups out there, right? I think one of the earliest groups that I worked with was up at Clay Avenue in the Bronx, right? And in historic districts like that, just a tiny 2-block historic district, everyone's getting older and grayer, new people are moving in, they may not necessarily know why it was designated or even anyone who was involved with that designation. Keeping that flame alive so that they're intact and they're involved and they're learning from well-founded groups like this one, engaged groups like this one, savvy groups like this one. I would say groups that have a sense of humor and who are fun to hang out with as well. I've been to many of your events over the years. These are the templates for those future conversations. So to answer your direct question, I think that it's a blessing and a curse, right? That we have that ambiguity, but the gift is it keeps us engaged with that process moving forward.
I think that's a really important way of looking at it. The discretion element is in some ways the best and the worst thing about the landmarks law. Shifting gears a little bit, let me ask you, why a podcast? You are somebody who clearly cares tremendously about preservation. You're very dedicated to kind of getting the word out there, engaging the public. Why the podcast group?
Sure. First episode, I made a little aside, right? And I said, one of the ulterior motives for this podcast is to get more people involved in caring about preservation. But again, not just preservation's sake. A lot of it had to do with seeding fertile ground. When I was at the Historic Districts Council, we had a partnership with Uber, of all companies, right? Anybody remember the Tunnel, the old club on the west side? They had taken that beautiful designated building and turned it into their headquarters, right? You always hear, oh, young people in corporations, they want new, hip, glass, tall, spindly. Not at all, right? I'm, allegedly a young person. We have some more than in the group here tonight. We have many supporters of them on Village Preservation's website and social media channels. And I think all of them would say that a future that includes its past is a really beautiful thing. And it also makes us money, right? So we are actually pro-preservation because it checks a lot of boxes for us. And so why a podcast? Because we wanted to seed some fertile ground. The Historical Society of New York Courts, great example. These are the people who are the custodians of our historic courthouse. Are they versed in the language of preservation? No. Have they heard of a group like Village Preservation? Well, they have after tonight, and that's a great thing. But not necessarily. So it's finding those allies out there and really targeting the legal community, which brought the podcast about. And the thing about attorneys, right, we are often traditionalists. We live and die by precedent. And so I think people who are attracted to precedent and who are attracted to the rule of law and what came before them and what happens in the future, that's another fertile ground for preservation allies. So that's another reason for the podcast. And a third was, and we touched on it at the end of this presentation, right? It affords us the opportunity to have a conversation. I was asked about this project, how long is your podcast? And my answer was, it is as long or as short as the conversation goes. Now, of course, we edit it, but we take great pains to ensure that we are taking the conversation where it goes. And as you saw when we spoke about our latest episode about Judge Manton, there's not that direct preservation tie-in up front, right? But we get there, and we're drawing people in from different interests and backgrounds. And the final thing, of course, is that it's free, right? Adrian Untermyer, we talked about it a little bit earlier. He had this wonderful tradition up in Yonkers of opening the gates of Untermyer Gardens so it's free for all to experience and be inspired. That tradition continues to this day. There is no admission charge at Untermyer Gardens. If somebody asks for one, you should call 911 because they are probably impersonating somebody. But it is free and open to all, and that's the great thing about podcasting. I don't get paid for the podcast. You don't have to pay to listen to it. It's starting that conversation and engaging in ideas. I want to mention the late Joan Kaplan Davidson, too, who we unfortunately just lost recently. A true lioness. Not knowing the background, I'm sure she was somehow involved either in the genesis of this adaptive reuse here or subsequent renovations and restorations. But look at Joan's legacy, right? She not only funded, she also got her hands dirty. You can read all about that in the New York Times obituary that ran. She is remembered fondly, not because she asked anyone for anything, but because she gave. And so with the podcast, I hopefully am able to give, our guests certainly are able to give, and you're able to give and take and engage in that conversation in a way where an op-ed doesn't necessarily do it, right? That's just a one-directional conversation. There's no comment section, generally speaking, in an op-ed, and if it is, some people read it, but it's never featured up top, right? I have a friend in the audience here, Jake Zellweger. He and I often start texting when we see that the New York Times has opened up an article for comment. That doesn't seem like a natural conversation the way that the podcast is. And of course, Andrew mentioned at the top, we do have some cards in the back, so if you do want to get in touch, suggest future topics, come on the show yourself if you have a good idea. That's the sort of thing we want to do. So why a podcast? Long list of reasons, but I think it helps our movement overall, is my hope.
Thank you. Thank you for the explanation. Also, thank you for mentioning Joan, who lived an incredibly long and impactful life. She was a long-time advisor at Village Preservation, as were both Jane Jacobs and Mark O'Gall. We were very proud to have them on our board of advisors, so it's always wonderful to see things about their legacy. Let me, switching gears a little bit, let's, I just want to, this could be, a whole 3-hour conversation, but I'll just ask you for, kind of 3 minutes of thought on this. The law and preservation. As kind of said in the description for tonight's program, the fight to preserve our history takes place in so many different places. It's the court of public opinion, it's the corporate boardrooms, it's in the streets, but the law clearly has a lot to do with it. And in some cases, the law is ostensibly settled. We have a landmarks law. The Supreme Court ruled in the Grand Central case and said, we affirm that the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission has the power to do these things. But it's still shifting, and it's still being reinterpreted, and it's still being litigated. Literally every day, somebody reaches out to me and says, why don't you sue the Landmarks Preservation Commission for not obeying the law because they did this or they didn't do that? It's not so simple to do. In simple terms, what are your thoughts about the role that the law plays in terms of our preservation efforts?
Absolutely, it's front and center. And I think before law comes politics, right? Because politics is how we resolve our disputes peaceably in most cases, January 6th, the Civil War, all these other examples accepted. It's how we try and resolve our disputes civilly without drawing blood. You look at the long sweep of human history, right? Until relatively recently in the clock of time, you would kill somebody else if you disagree with them. You would take their resources, take their land. We don't do that anymore. I think that's a good thing. We have turned to politics to resolve those disputes. And through our politics, we craft a system of laws which, if left alone, they're there, and they're there for us. But if we don't like them, there's that nice big building up in Albany, there's that beautiful building with the gold dome down in Washington. That's where we go to change them. Often we go to the courthouse to change them. So yes, the law is front and center when it comes to preservation, but we have to make sure we follow the chain to where the law is really given life, and that is with we the people. We forget that today. And I think one thing that sometimes frustrates me about other movements, there's this talk of disenfranchisement. Well, look at the civil rights movement, right? In that example in particular, people got out and demanded things. And when that veil was lifted for the rest of the world to see, people got involved, got engaged, and really made some change in the world, including constitutional amendments, which we have not seen in a very, very long time in this country. I think the last one had to do with pay for legislators or something like that in the 1990s, right? That's how it's supposed to work. And so we are all involved in the political process here, right? I mean, many of us vote. I would hope most of us vote. Some of you may be on judicial screening panels. Some of you may be county leaders, district leaders, whatever it is. You're getting involved in the process, and that's where this all comes from. Trace the lineage of these people, and that's where you're getting it from. So the law is front and center, but the law can be changed, and the law can be changed by people like us, right? One great idea that I've always heard bandied about, and kind of happens and doesn't happen, would be a constitutional amendment, right? A constitutional amendment to the New York State Constitution, which is, of course, a very lengthy and arcane document. But if you're able to muster the forces for it, you can have something like a height limit in the New York State Constitution, right? That is very doable. That is a state police power. But it's not really something that we talk about too much, right? A constitution is just a bunch of words. You can make it as specific or as vague as you want. You look at our arguments over things like who is a person in the United States of America, and we're interpreting things like the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, which is certainly up to debate and interpretation. But there are other documents that are super specific and really reflect your values. And so as we look at the preservation battles of the future, I almost want us to get back to the roots of things a little bit more, right? We've had this law since 1965. I don't necessarily think it's a good idea to open up the hood on the law, right? Because then the bad people will do what bad people always do. But getting creative about where to seed, there's that word again, seed ideas and seed teeth throughout the system, that is very doable. And I think one great thing, again, speaking to the example that this group serves for the entire preservation community, you have such good relationships with elected officials, and of course your legacy coming out of the political space. Village preservation understands how to get things done and how to make a ruckus when things are not being done right. And so again, I also think it comes to patterning and educating. You know, I think bringing other groups in and partnering with them, celebrating histories that are not necessarily the history of Greenwich Village, but the history of preservation and finding a Greenwich Village tie-in. I think this group does a great job of that. And ultimately, if we want to influence the law, it's that long game. It's doing all of those things that you do so well. Only more and even better, right? That's how you change laws. That's how you change politics, and it's also how you change minds. And I think that's the last piece.
Well, thank you for those kind words. And you know, we've also been hesitant to tinker with the landmarks law because you never know what's going to come out of that process. But we have actually been successful at getting some other laws that affect preservation without it being the landmarks law changed, rules around what's considered a dorm and when, how you can build it, or other things that regulate, for instance, how and where universities can build structures and things like that. So there's ways of doing it where you can be a little more surgical. One last question from me, and I'm not sure there's a simple answer to this. Who is the Ada Louise Huxtable of today? Who do we look to give us wit and wisdom about our built environment?
We look within. We are all Ada Louise deep down, and I think that the beauty of this social media environment is that we can self-publish, right? This is obviously supported by the Historical Society of New York Court, so there's an institutional backer, but you can write something on Facebook and you can reach a broad reach, right? Andrew and I were talking about this event, and I was going to send out an e-blast over the weekend about it, and I didn't need to because it was sold out, right? And that just happened from word of mouth, you know, one or two emails and one or two social media posts. So yes, there are critics out there who are writing about architecture. We can all name their names. I don't think anyone is really going out to the newsstand and necessarily waiting, or to the proverbial newsstand online, waiting to see the next column, the way that some people I've heard, I obviously wasn't around at the time, did for Ada Louise. But we have such more diversity of thought and diversity of conversation. When I was at the Historic Districts Council, I really did want to do a podcast then. We had so many other things going on, including, and this touches back on your last point about the law and litigation. You know, there was a major litigation, some of us remember, Save America's Clocks. This involved the Sacred Clock Tower down at 346 Broadway. If you ever got a ticket for being in the park after hours or something worse, you may remember you had to go there and appear before a judge at one point. But then I believe it was Don Peebles who somehow got involved with reinventing that space, and he wanted to rip out the historic clock mechanism and turn it into a penthouse for some rich person. It's litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court, which of course in New York is the lowest court. And they said, no, it's a terrible idea. You did it wrong. No. Goes up to the appellate division, first department. Justice Ellen Gesmer, who I believe has been a villager throughout her life, writes a raucous and wonderful opinion saying, absolutely not. And I had the great privilege of working for Justice Gesmer when she was at the appellate division, and she has, in fact, returned to the appellate division. That's an interesting tangent, if anyone wants to Google it later. But that case goes up to the Court of Appeals in Albany, which of course in New York State is our highest court. And they didn't do the right thing, right? They reversed, and of course the clock tower is no more. And there was talk at the time about, do we bring this all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States? Those 9 people in rows who hang out in Washington, D.C., do what they do. I saw somebody with a Roe versus Wade shirt around here today. You know how fickle and how pretextual they have been and can be and will be. So when you can't rely on the justice system per se, right, when you feel like you're not in an environment where you can bring things all the way up the ladder, you've got to work with what you've got, right? And what you've got is the preservation. And that's why I think that events like this, people like you, initiatives like what GVSHP do are so important, because that's our backstop as a democracy. We cannot leave it up to anybody else. So if we're out there doing the right work, fighting for the right things, and educating and bringing people who are not like us along with us, only good things can happen. So that is by no means an answer to the original question, but it's a fantastic segue to our Q&A here. So,
Exactly. Well, this is a conversation, so let me actually open it up to the audience for questions. In the back.
I'm discouraged about the future for New York, largely because the historic districts are so tiny compared to the city overall, and there's so much space that the real estate industry can exploit to maximize profits at the expense of people. For example, 157th Street, there's no protection. I mean, 110 stories, spindle buildings going up year after year. What can be done absent a historic district designation politically to safeguard the city from these kinds of profit grabs?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I'll also add one element to your question, which is even when something is designated as a historic district, as we know, the Landmarks Commission is often not the best about enforcing, right? And they'll often give a pass to something that
We're interpreting it.
Exactly. So I think that's a fantastic question. I think that really strikes at the essence, right? Because we're talking about all this today. These are concepts up in clouds. One concrete thing I think we can do, I will hazard a guess that every single person in this room knows somebody who lives in a different neighborhood, right? Talk to them and see what's on their mind. Talk to them and see what's on their mind. And have them talk to their neighbors and see what's on their mind. And if there is even a germ of consensus within that community, even if it's 2, 3, 4, 5 people, maybe a block, maybe 2 blocks, maybe there's an existing group out there, maybe there's a sympathetic legislator, or rather, maybe there's somebody who writes a blog or has a good Twitter account or whatever it is, get them talking about what they want. And don't let it go on too long, right? We've seen a lot of really unnecessary demolitions lately. There was that Grand Prospect Hall out in Brooklyn, right? This one really broke my heart. We remember, not I again, but many of us remember those advertisements about that space. People at their weddings, or other celebrations, there are other happenings there. A couple of young guys, right? Teenagers, I believe it was, start putting stuff out on social media after it was too late. And one thing I did hear from some reservations at the time was, that's too late. Wasted opportunity, right? Okay, you lost. They lost at Penn Station, but we have a preservation movement in this room, online, all over the nation, all over the state and the city. So take that passion that you're seeing from these people, even though it's not many, and get organized, because getting organized is how you get results. It's as simple as that. We live in a representative democracy / republic, however you want to call it, and if you are knocking on your legislators' doors and making it impossible to ignore the situation you're raising, you may not win the battle. Penn Station may get demolished, right? We saw it again and again. Castle Clinton ripped out that McKinley and White Aquarium, dumped the fish in the sea. But they kept going. They kept chipping away, and they used that tiny little seed they had there to build something better. So that is my answer to your question. I so appreciate the question.
And I'll just second how incredibly important it is to elect people to office who care about these issues. You can have the best laws. If the people who are running the city don't believe in them, don't believe in their efficacy, don't believe that they should be there, they're going to enforce them in ways that are not good, or they're not going to enforce them. The other thing that I would just say is just as important as landmarking is good zoning. And that's a whole other conversation. But you can have an area that's not landmarked but have good zoning, and that ensures that the development that you get is the right kind of development, and it makes it much less likely that you'll lose the sort of things that you don't want to lose that are there.
And to your point about talking to legislators, if you're not talking to them, someone else is, right? You can bet your boots they are. So be in that conversation. You know, Andrew mentioned earlier in the railroad world during my day job, right? Amtrak had a leader a couple of years ago that people couldn't stand. He was trying to turn it into an airline. So a gentleman named Ben Levin owns some property next to the Northeast Corridor, and he put up 2 signs, and they're still there now. You can see them if you're going to Philly. It says, "Save Amtrak, fire Anderson." And guess what happened? They fired Anderson. As every single person on their management team saw that every day, and as soon as he started to slip, the knives came out for him, right? So that is what being there means.